Princess Anne had walked these palace corridors for 60 years, and she had never once needed someone to tell her where she was going. Her footsteps landed on the marble floor with a quiet authority, not loud, not hurried, simply certain. The kind of walk that belongs to someone who grew up in these rooms and never forgot them, even when the world outside changed completely. The afternoon light came through the tall windows in long golden strips, painting the stone floor like something from an old painting. Dust moved in the air above the paintings. Everything smelled faintly of beeswax and history. She was alone, which was the way she preferred it in these particular hours. No assistant followed her. No secretary walked 2 steps behind with a tablet full of notes. And had spent her entire life surrounded by people doing exactly that, and she had quietly decided decades ago that some parts of the day belonged only to her. This walk, in this corridor, before the evening's obligations began, was one of them. She passed the Darnley portrait without looking at it. She had looked at it 10,000 times. She passed the side table with the enormous flower arrangement that someone replaced every Tuesday. She did not look at that either. She simply walked, and the corridor received her the way it always had, without ceremony, without applause, without any particular interest at all. Ahead of her, at the far end of the corridor, a young guard stood at his post. He was perhaps 25 years old. His uniform was pressed to the point of discomfort. His back was entirely straight, the kind of straight that newer officers achieve through effort rather than habit. He was standing the way people stand when they're still remembering to stand properly, rather than simply doing it. His name was Corporal James Hadley. He had been assigned to this particular rotation 11 days ago. He had stood in this corridor 11 times, and every time he did, he learned something new about the strange and particular silence of this place. Today he would learn something he had not expected. He heard the footsteps before he saw her, that measured, unhurried sound, and he adjusted his posture slightly, returning his gaze to straight ahead. He had learned that looking too interested was just as wrong as not looking interested enough. In these halls, the correct expression was professional, present, and entirely neutral. And came down the corridor without acknowledgement of him, which was entirely normal. And then everything else began. The door opened. Not gently. Not with any particular awareness of what it was interrupting. Camilla's sitting room was 30 feet down the corridor, to the left, and its door opened the way a door opens when the person on the other side of it is thinking about something other than the door entirely. It swung wide. It hit the wall behind it with a small, firm sound. Camilla came out already mid-sentence. She was speaking to a member of the household staff, a young woman in a dark uniform who was making the particular face that palace staff made when they were listening very carefully while also hoping to become slightly invisible. She had a notebook pressed to her chest and her eyes were directed precisely at the floor. Camilla was not shouting. That was not quite the right word for it. She was speaking at a volume and with a certainty that filled the entire corridor with very little effort, the way some voices simply do. She was displeased about something, that much was clear. The details came in pieces. Something had been arranged incorrectly for that evening's dinner. The floral arrangement had been changed without her approval. There had been some confusion about the seating, and that confusion had apparently arrived too late in the day to be anything other than a problem. The words traveled down the stone corridor and hit everything they touched. The portraits received them. The flower arrangement received them. Corporal James Hadley received them. And Princess Anne, who was perhaps 20 feet away and closing the distance at her usual pace, received them too. She did not slow down. She did not speed up. She continued at exactly the same measured pace, her footsteps falling in exactly the same rhythm, her expression carrying exactly the same quality it had been carrying since she left her rooms. She walked through the noise the way a person walks through weather, acknowledging it with no part of her face. Hadley watched this. He could not entirely help watching it. He had been trained for many things. He had been trained to identify threats, to maintain position, to respond to various situations with the correct combination of presence and restraint. He had been briefed on protocol, on procedure, on the specific etiquette required when members of the royal family moved through spaces that he was responsible for. No part of that training had prepared him for this specific moment. He was standing at the intersection of two very different energies moving toward each other in a narrow stone corridor, and he had approximately 4 seconds to determine what the correct thing to do was. He did not look at Camilla. This was the decision, small, almost invisible, gone in less than a second. He kept his eyes directed forward, which meant his eyes were directed, in the most general and peripheral possible way, toward Princess Anne, who was still walking, still entirely herself. He returned his gaze to the middle distance, which is where it was supposed to be. He found his neutral expression and he kept it. He stood at his post. That was all. He stood at his post. But Anne saw it. She saw it the way she saw most things, completely, quickly, and without making any particular show of seeing it. She reached his position and she stopped. This was unexpected. In 11 days at this post, no member of the royal family had stopped at his position for any reason other than to pass through. They walked past him the way people walked past furniture, not unkindly, simply without needing to stop. He was part of the corridor. He was there to do a job. Stopping was not part of anyone's usual behavior. And stopped. She stood perhaps 3 feet from him, and she looked at him the way people look at someone when they are not performing the act of looking but simply doing it. There was nothing warm or cold about it. It was an assessment, and it was finished very quickly, and it came to some conclusion that she did not share with him or with anyone else. The corridor still carried the sound of Camilla's voice at the far end. It had not stopped. The young staff member was now walking back toward the service corridor with her notebook held a little tighter. And said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "How long have you been on this rotation?" Her voice was entirely level. Not friendly, not unfriendly. The question of a person who actually wants to know the answer and is not asking it to make conversation. 11 days, ma'am, Hadley said. His voice came out correctly, which he was quietly grateful for. She nodded once. It was not a large nod. It was the nod of someone who has been given information and has placed it where it belongs. "You're doing well," she said. And then she walked. She did not expand on this. She did not explain what she meant or in which specific regard she found him to be doing well. She offered no additional warmth to soften the statement or additional context to clarify it. She simply said it, and then she resumed walking, and by the time Hadley had fully processed that it had happened, she had already turned left at the end of the corridor and was gone. The corridor was quiet again, in the way it was always quiet, that particular palace quiet that sat underneath all other sounds like a foundation, always there, never quite leaving. Hadley stood at his post. He breathed. He considered what had just occurred. Several hours later, Hadley was in the staff break room on the lower level, and he was drinking tea that had been sitting in the pot for too long, and he was not saying very much to the 2 other guards sitting across from him. This was not unusual. He was not, by nature, an especially talkative person. He had grown up in a quiet house in a small town in the north of England, and he had joined the army at 18 with the intention of seeing something of the world, and he had arrived, through a series of steps that had felt logical at the time, at a position that placed him in the private corridors of Buckingham Palace. He was still, in small and private ways, surprised by this. One of the other guards, a man named Reeves, who had been doing this for 6 years and carried that experience lightly in every movement he made, looked across the table at Hadley and said, "Quiet shift." Hadley thought about it. "More or less," he said. Reeves nodded. He had learned not to ask further questions when people said more or less in that particular tone. Something had happened, and either it would become a story or it would not, and pressing on it never helped either outcome. Hadley turned the mug of bad tea in his hands and looked at the wall. What Anne had said to him was 2 sentences. 11 words. The kind of thing that, written down and shown to someone without context, would appear entirely ordinary. A supervisor acknowledging a new employee. A brief confirmation of satisfactory performance. Nothing more. But he had been standing in that corridor, and he had felt the weight of what Camilla's voice was doing to the air around him, and he had made a choice, a small, almost invisible choice about where to look and how to stand, and someone had seen that choice. Not just seen it. Recognized it. That was the thing he kept returning to. The word he kept finding when he turned the moment over in his mind. Recognition. She had looked at him and recognized something specific. Not that he had been standing properly, which was the baseline of the job. Not that he had not done anything wrong, which was simply the minimum. She had seen that he had understood something difficult about where he was and what the moment required of him, and she had acknowledged it in the most economical way possible. 2 sentences. No explanation. Gone. The royal family had been doing this for a very long time. Delivering meaning in the smallest possible containers. He thought about that. Thought about what it meant to be the kind of person who could say, "You're doing well," to a young guard in a corridor after a complicated moment and have that phrase carry the exact weight it needed to carry and no more. He thought this required a certain kind of precision that was not the same as coldness, even if it looked similar from the outside. Back in the corridor, the evening had arrived. The golden afternoon light had gone from the tall windows and been replaced by something softer and less directional, the light of lamps rather than sun, and the whole space had shifted slightly in its feeling, the way old rooms shift when the day changes, taking on a different character without anything actually moving. Camilla's door was closed now, had been closed for the past hour. Whatever the matter had been, the flowers, the seating, the thing that arrived too late, it had presumably been resolved or set aside or handed to someone whose job it was to make such things disappear before dinner. The corridor had absorbed the sound of all of it and then returned to its usual state, which was the state of a place that had seen a great deal across a great many years and found most things to be temporary. The staff member with the notebook had come back through an hour later, without the notebook, with a slightly different expression. She had walked quickly and with purpose and had not looked up as she passed. A different guard had taken Hadley's position. His shift had ended at 6. And somewhere in the upper rooms of the palace, and was preparing for the evening, changing, perhaps, or sitting with something to read for the 20 minutes before she needed to be anywhere, or simply doing whatever it was that she did in the time between the public parts of her day and the next public part. Nobody outside the very small circle around her knew exactly how she spent those transitions. She had been a princess for her entire life and she had protected certain hours with a consistency that most people found impressive and some found impossible to understand. She had also, at some point in the past 60 years, developed a very precise understanding of what it took to do difficult things with dignity. Not the performed kind of dignity, the kind that involves a great deal of visible effort and self-consciousness. The other kind. The kind that simply continued walking through a corridor in the same rhythm it had been walking at before any noise began, because the rhythm belonged to the person walking and not to the environment around them. This was a thing that could not be taught in any obvious way. It was not in any briefing or protocol document. It could not be practiced in a training exercise. It could only be observed, in real moments, by people paying close enough attention. Hadley had been paying attention. That was what she had seen. He took the tube home. It was the same journey he made every evening, the journey that carried him from one of the most extraordinary buildings in the country to the very ordinary flat he shared with a university friend in a part of London where the buildings were not old and the ceilings were not high and there were no portraits on the walls at all. He sat in his coat on the tube and he watched the tunnel go past in the dark windows, and he thought. He thought about the difference between doing a job correctly and understanding what a job is actually for. He had done the first 11 days ago, when he arrived for his first shift and stood where he was told to stand and did exactly what his training told him to do. He was doing the second now, or beginning to. You began to understand what a job was actually for when someone saw you doing it well in a difficult moment and told you so. Not praised you. Not rewarded you. Simply told you so, in 2 sentences, without slowing down very much. There was a difference. He thought about Camilla's voice in the corridor and about the way Anne had walked through it, and he thought about what it would take to be that consistent in the face of that kind of noise. He was 25 and he had a reasonable amount of confidence in his own abilities, but he was also honest enough with himself to know that he did not yet know how to do what she had done in that corridor. He was not sure how many years of practice were required. He suspected quite a few. The train came to his stop. He got off, walked the 6 minutes to his building, took the stairs. His flatmate was watching something on the television and offered him a curry from the fridge, which he accepted. He sat on the sofa. He ate the curry. He did not tell his flatmate what had happened. Not because it was secret, exactly. More because he was not sure he had the right words for it yet. There were moments that needed to sit for a while before they could be explained to anyone else, and this was one of them. He would need more time with it before he could take it out and show it to another person without losing the thing that made it matter. He watched the television for a while. He went to bed. In the morning he would go back. He would take his position in the corridor. He would stand with his back straight in the way that would become natural to him one day, if he was patient with it. He would watch the morning light come through the tall windows and move across the marble floor and disappear. And if the moment came again, some different version of that moment, because in these halls some version of it always came again, because that was the nature of the work, he would know, now, what it looked like to do it properly. He had been shown. That was enough.